Welcome to Faith 2020's Roundtable with the Transition on Religious Liberty. My name is Reverend Adam Nicholas Phillips, Executive Director of Faith 2020. I'm very excited to have this very, very thoughtful, reflective panel during an immense time of transition and change and concern. With the events of the last week, we know that faith communities and spiritual communities across this country and leaders of no particular belief are critical to seeking the peace and the welfare of all people in our country. And so that's the kind of tenor that we hope to have in this conversation today. We are joined by Josh Dixon, Faith Engagement Director for the Biden-Harris Transition Team, Reverend Dr. Carolyn J. Davis, Founder, Principal of CJD Strategies, Dr. Sabrina Dent, Senior Faith Advisor, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Rori Kramer, Director of U.S. Advocacy, American Jewish World Service, Dr. Simran Jeet Singh, Senior Fellow at the Sikh Coalition, Maggie Siddiqui, Director, Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative, Center for American Progress, Jen Smyers, Director of Policy and Advocacy, Immigration and Refugee Program, Church World Service, and Bishop Joseph W. Tolton, Executive Director of Global Ministries, the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. We are so grateful that you can join us today. And if you'd like to share with your friends, we will be live streaming on Facebook at /Faith 2020 US. And without further ado, Josh Dixon, welcome.
Thanks so much, Adam. And thank you, friends, for having us here on behalf of the Biden-Harris transition team. As Adam mentioned, my name is Josh Dixon. And we're here with heavy hearts today after the events of last week. Want to acknowledge that and just want to acknowledge the trauma and everything that has come with those events, as well as things that have led up to them. The incoming administration will have numerous challenges, and bringing the country together is clearly one of them. We're grateful for this conversation today, and for all the wonderful folks who are participating, who are tuning in on Zoom and Facebook Live, and the speakers. Just an incredible group of folks, many friends, and folks who I just have the utmost respect for. So really appreciate you all and this opportunity to sit and listen in and be a part of this. We know this is an important topic. As Religious Freedom Day comes up on January 16th, we know that this is something that's been a part of the core of our country and our Constitution, our values for a very, very long time. And we also know that approaching it in a way that upholds the inherent human dignity of everyone is deeply important as well. I want to share on the behalf of the transition. We have been in conversations, hearing from folks about this issue and others. We've had meetings with hundreds and actually thousands of different organizations. Many folks who are a part of the call today, as well as folks who are tuning in, have been a part of some of those conversations. I know the administration is looking forward to continuing those after January 20th. We've had a number of roundtables with our nominees for key cabinet positions with faith leaders, including having more this week. We've been doing policy reviews and taking in different recommendations that folks have been sending our way. So we're deeply grateful for all that. I feel like it's been a really successful transition in terms of hearing from folks and having a chance to robustly engage in the lead up to what will be a tremendously consequential presidency. Also, just want to say one of the things that has been very heartening for me as a part of this transition is just hearing all the common ground across faith groups and faith groups across the political spectrum on a multitude of different issues. I think that there's a real eagerness for folks to come together, to work together on healing our country, but also working on critical issues that are impacting marginalized communities across the board. So just very much looking forward to what that will look like in the Biden-Harris administration. I know the president-elect and vice president-elect send their regards, and they're looking forward to working with the interfaith community as well. Final two things. I'm going to be entering this conversation in listening mode, as we are not yet the government, but on January 20th, things will change in that regard. But for now, we're very much hearing from folks, continuing to get information and recommendations. So I'm just really eager to tune in and be a part of hearing all the great things that folks have to say. And then I want to highlight Tomorrow night, we are hosting an event with Congressman Cedric Richmond, the incoming director of the Office of Public Engagement at the White House, with Dr. Vivek Murthy, the nominee for Surgeon General, who has previously served as Surgeon General and is also a co-chair of the COVID task force, with Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner, who leads the National African American Clergy Network, and with Reverend Gabriel Salguero, who leads the National Latino Evangelical Coalition. And this event is focused on COVID and communities of color. So we know that there's a lot of concerns and hesitancy and different things like that out there. So going to give folks a chance to hear some commonly asked questions, to get to ask questions and whatnot. We'll send out information about that later, but that'll be from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. tomorrow night. If folks have a small group or a Bible study or any sort of faith-based engagement or anything like that, we encourage you to invite the fellow folks who will be a part of that to this event. Even if it's tomorrow, maybe you could all tune in. We know that this is really, really important. We've seen the challenges of COVID that they continue to present to our country. So we'll share more information about that. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Adam and just say again, thank you so much for having me here. Really looking forward to hearing from folks.
Thanks so much, Josh. We really appreciate all the hard work that the transition's doing, and we continue to hold you all up and your families in this very difficult time. As you know, the matters of religious liberty are not so much for us issues to divide, but issues in which that require an intersectional gaze, an intersectional approach in which we might look at the foundational principles of what we share in common, which are liberty and equity and inclusion. And so I'm really grateful for this panel today. I'm especially grateful to hand it over to Dr. Sabrina Dent. And Dr. Dent, I wanted to ask you this question as we kick off our conversation. I think it can help us root down the conversation we're having right now. And that is this. Last week during the insurrection at the Capitol, you tweeted an image of the makeshift gallows erected on the Capitol grounds, along with the caption, "White supremacy, racism, bigotry, and white privilege are deeply held values at the core of Christian nationalism." This image speaks volumes about their warped and distorted understanding of religious freedom. This is hashtag Christian nationalism and domestic terrorism on display. We do not yet know what awaits the notion on Inauguration Day, but we do know that President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris face unprecedented challenges at a moment when so many of our institutions are in unrepentant challenges at a moment when so many of our institutions are in urgent need of reform. Dr. Dent, can you speak a bit to the intersectional nature of your tweets and how the new administration can best attend to the relationship between anti-racism and religious freedom?
Adam, thank you so much for your question. And I wanted to thank the Faith Transition Team, the Biden-Harris Transition Team, as well as Dr. Carolyn Davis and Union Theological Seminary for inviting me to be a part of this conversation today. Yes, that tweet that was sent out last week spoke to, one, I would say, my personal pain and experience of witnessing the events that took place. I think it's important for people to realize that when we're doing any type of work in the public space or any issue, that we really shouldn't disconnect ourselves from the issue because we're human beings. And so the reality is seeing the events that transpired on Capitol Hill last week just reminded me of the history and the DNA of this country. And so we have to really engage in a truth-telling moment about what we saw and what we witnessed. One of the things that I observed in the images that I saw between the noose, the cross, the Jesus Save signs, and a host of other things is the reality of this sense of claiming a certain identity for our country that the country itself was not founded to be, right? It was not founded to be a Christian nation. It was not founded to minimize and dehumanize the identities of others, although there is the reality that people of color that were brought to the Americas and spread across the different continents did not have the right to religious freedom. But because I'm very fortunate to do this work, that I think very intersectionally about these issues. And so when I saw that, I thought about the question, what did those images not only mean to me as a Black woman in America, But what did it mean to my Muslim brothers and sisters? What did it mean to other racial and religious minorities? What did that mean to non-religious people that are in this country? Keeping in mind that religious freedom is a constitutional and a human right that applies to everyone. And so in that, we have to include the perspectives of everyone on this topic. And so, yes, for me, it raised the question of how deep is, or the lack of understanding of the individuals that were on the Capitol grounds, as far as what it means for everyone to have religious freedom in this country. What does it mean for it to be protected? And so I think very deeply about this work, because I come from a perspective of being the ancestor and the descendant of an enslaved African who wasn't emancipated until April of 1865. And I think of my own eclectic foundation, coming from a Pentecostal tradition where my dad was a pastor, but also the fact that I was licensed as a Baptist minister. And at some point in my life, I studied Scientology, and I also engaged in Buddhist meditation. What does it mean as a person to be in community with and to advocate for those who have different belief systems from what you do, but where you can find common ground? And so the last thing I want to add to that is seeing the events of last week reminded me of my relationship with people. Right. That it's important that we are relational in the work that we do. It shouldn't be transactional. If anyone saw the images that took place, I hope that you immediately thought about the people that you care about, the people that you call friends. Also, and to really understand that that it showed me that our country also needs a lesson in civic engagement as well as American history. And I cannot deny the fact that as I watched the events, although I was shocked, I was still not surprised. Because again, we have to remember the history in this country, and keeping in mind when the first Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, of the 55 delegates, there was only one present that spoke about the enslavement of individuals, but that was knocked off the agenda. And so it says to me, from the foundation of this country, what are the priorities? And then in this current moment, how can we speak to the priorities of all of those that are even on this call and those that are watching right now? And for me, I was thinking about the people that I care about and I love. When I wrote out that tweet, I was thinking also about the events that happened in December, when historically Black churches were targeted. And so what does it mean to really understand religious freedom through the perspectives and the lenses of other people's experiences? What does it mean to understand it through the lens of the most marginalized person? Could that possibly be someone that comes from an African nation that has a ban against them right now? Could it be someone that is that might identify as a member of the LGBTQ community and still be a part of a religious minority? What does it look like for America and for politicians and citizens to take seriously the concerns of the people that are around them and their neighbors? And so it's a much deeper issue than just looking at it and saying like, oh, this riot happened and this insurrection happened. It was a tragic event for many of us to watch and see, but we have to really, we have to name what we saw. We have to speak to it. We have to speak truth about the history that has occurred in America, and be bold enough to address policies that consider and center the most marginalized people, and policies that do not cause harm nor discrimination. And so I'll yield the rest of my time and save some remarks for later.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sabrina. Very, very important to name it. I think putting words to our experience and to name what we saw last Wednesday is foundationally important in order for us to move forward. And so to that end, Simran, I've been very grateful for your writing during this season, and it seems like it's been an ongoing long season of campaigning and change. I was hoping to ask you to talk about the most urgent faith-related priorities for the Biden-Harris administration when it comes to religious freedom in your mind, and when it comes to anti-racism.
Great, wonderful, thank you. And thank you for having me. It's always a blessing to be in the company of like-minded people who are trying to make our world better and more just. I think our conversation is critical right now, given what we're seeing transpire in this country. Understanding how racism and religious discrimination are connected and how they conspire to animate violence, this has never felt more important to me. And I know a little bit about how this works. I was born and raised to immigrant parents in San Antonio, Texas. My brothers and me were the only turban-wearing Sikhs, not just in our city, but in all of South Texas. So we learned pretty early that we were different. And we learned pretty early that looking different, with our turbans and beards and brown skin, it meant that we would be treated differently, that our religious identities were racialized. So here's a simple example of how racism and religious discrimination played out in our lives. When I was in middle school, I had to petition the US Soccer Federation to change its headwear policy so that I could continue playing the sport that I loved. My older brother, Harpreet, had to petition the high school governing body in Texas so he could play for his high school basketball team. My younger brother, Darsh, had to do the same thing for the NCAA to play college basketball. And the point for me here is that these policies may not have been intended as exclusionary or racist, but they were, and they are. What I'm talking about here is institutionalized racism. How do our racist ideas come to be codified as policies and create inequities within our communities? And here's what I've learned over the years. Our best chance at overturning these policies is to help those in power see how these policies could be well-intended, yet harmful. And this is one reason why I feel enthusiastic about the Biden-Harris transition team and about Josh Dixon, because they're open to seeing how racial justice intersects with religious freedom, and they're making this issue a top priority. And I want to say, I believe that engaging seriously with racial justice and religious freedom is critical for three reasons. First, religion is the parent of white supremacy. The two are inextricably linked. Just a year after Columbus arrived in North America, Pope Alexander VI issued the Doctrine of Discovery, which announced that Christians were superior to the indigenous heathens and therefore had the right to colonize them. This laid the groundwork for American racism. So we can't understand American racism without attending to its religious roots. Second, religion has been weaponized to uphold American racism. Or in other words, white supremacy often cloaks itself in the disguise of religion. We can look to how Christian slaveholders used the Bible to sanctify the enslavement of darker skinned people. Or we can look at how President Trump cleared racial justice protesters on his way to St. John's Church for a photo op with the Bible. And third, religious minorities are racialized. Religious minorities deal with racism because of how they look and what they believe. And this racism has dire consequences for all of us. It's why we devote so many resources to combating foreign terrorism, yet remain unable to act against white nationalism, even when we've known for years that white domestic terrorism poses the greatest threat to our national security. And it's for this third point that I think we're gathered here today, to ask the question of how racist ideas conspire with racist policies to curtail religious freedom. Or to flip the question, how might an anti-racist lens and an intersectional lens help expand our guarantees of religious freedom? So here are 5 issues that my colleagues at the Sikh Coalition and I believe should be policy priorities for the Biden-Harris administration. First, the new administration must address Trump's decimation of America's refugee policy and the profound impact that it's had on religious freedom of abroad. For Muslims in places like China and Myanmar, this continues to mean life or death. In May 2020, candidate Biden made a public call for the State Department to consider emergency refugee protections for Afghan Sikh and Hindus, and he has repeatedly promised to raise the cap back up to 125,000. The sooner that can happen, the quicker we can begin to return to being a nation that helps the world's most desperate, many of whom are fleeing religious persecution. Second, immigration bans were a defining feature of the Trump administration, from a sweeping prohibition on travel from several Muslim-majority countries to broad restrictions on would-be immigrants and temporary workers. In 2021, the Biden administration has the chance to immediately repeal existing blanket immigration bans. It can urge Congress to pass the No Ban Act, which would not only overturn the Muslim travel ban, but can also guard against future abuse of law used to order it. Third, it's critical that the administration works actively and urgently to end employment discrimination. When we deny people the right to practice their faiths freely in the workplace, we ask them to choose between their sincerely held beliefs and their security and happiness. That's not right. The Biden administration can begin by committing to end any and all federal practices of workplace discrimination. And one place to look immediately would be the armed forces, our nation's largest employer. President-elect Biden made a campaign promise to ensure reasonable religious accommodations across all our armed services. And there's no doubt in our mind that now is the moment to get this done. Doing so would send the message to employers and Americans all across the country that this administration will not tolerate discrimination. Fourth, we must do more to keep religious minorities safe in schools. Children from religious minority groups remain disproportionately bullied in our nation's public classrooms. And among other measures, the Biden administration can work to ensure that additional funding is allocated to the DOJ and DOD for anti-bullying initiatives, and providing funding streams that will support educator professional development so that community organizations and experts can raise cultural awareness. Lastly, I have to mention one of the many last-minute initiatives in the final days of the Trump administration that will have a profoundly negative impact on all minority rights. In late December, the Justice Department quietly and without stakeholder consultation submitted for White House approval a dramatic change to how it interprets and enforces Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits any recipient of federal funding from discrimination based on race, color, or national origin. The DOJ amended rules call for narrow enforcement of the law's protections only in cases where it can prove both intentional discrimination and that any federal funding received was used for purposes of discriminatory practices or policies. The proposal, if successfully implemented, would become the first significant amendment to how the DOJ defines or enforces the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1973. And if this happens, the Biden administration must delay its implementation and then fix this as quickly as possible. Of course, there's a plethora of issues for the Biden administration to address, especially when it comes to racism and religious discrimination. These are a few of the priorities that I see as a racial and religious minority, as a scholar of religion, as a racial justice activist, and as a faith leader. It's been a rough few years for those of us who work in the justice space, and far longer for those of us whose families have been living through these challenges each and every day. I'm grateful to see leadership that truly cares and truly wants to build something together. I'm hopeful for what's to come in the next few years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simran. Really grateful for that, that word. If you're just joining us, we are recording this live stream and we will be sharing it later in edited form. But if you want to share it with friends right now, we're on Facebook at facebook.com/faith2020US. Maggie Siddiqui is next, and she is one of the first folks I met in this space when I moved to DC during another transition, which feels like 100 years ago, back in 2008 and 9. I'm really grateful that Maggie can join us today. And Maggie, what vision for religious freedom should undergird the shape and scope of faith-based offices and policies in the Biden-Harris administration? And how can these changes correct the ways the Trump administration has eroded protections for religious belief and practice?
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for that introduction, and for hosting this really important conversation today. Just for folks who don't know me, I'm Maggie Siddiqui, Senior Director of the Faith and Progressive Policy Initiative at the Center for American Progress. And as folks have already outlined so far, as with a number of other policy areas, the Biden administration really has its work cut out for it to protect religious freedom. The Trump administration has indeed, as you said, instituted a number of regulations that eroded protections for religious belief and practice while launching attacks on communities like my own. Shortly after this election was called for Joe Biden, over 100 prominent religious leaders sent a letter to his transition team encouraging him to take immediate action on religious freedom. And I want to share a link in the chat to that letter so you can take a look later. We recently also published a column at the Center for American Progress offering our recommendations for the Biden administration as they create and staff offices that can address these concerns. And I'll drop that one in the chat as well. The first set of recommendations we made is around religious community outreach. We believe that the White House Office of Public Engagement in particular will have an important role to play in engaging our nation's incredibly diverse religious communities on religious freedom as well as other issues. And we believe they should have diverse staff dedicated to religious outreach alongside other staff dedicated to outreach to other communities as well. And there's another office in the White House that we believe should have a specific mandate to champion religious freedom, and that is the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships within the White House's the White House's Domestic Policy Council. This office was created under President George W. Bush. It was continued under President Obama and then essentially gutted by President Trump. The office's mandate historically was to coordinate the work of the offices of faith-based and neighborhood partnerships within the different federal agencies. Each of these agencies facilitate the federal government's partnerships and funding opportunities for community-based organizations, including but not exclusively those that are faith-based. And a critical part of this work is ensuring protections for the separation of church and state. The First Amendment to the Constitution prohibits the government from privileging one religion over another or religion over non-religion. And unfortunately, the Trump administration eroded the separation of church and state in a number of ways, such as by exempting religious organizations that receive federal funding from having to comply with regulations that other organizations are obligated to follow. Most of these exemptions allow federally funded organizations to discriminate in the supposed name of religion against their employees or even against the people who they are receiving funds in order to serve. So people can be turned away from receiving food assistance or housing, et cetera. And these exemptions have been used in particular to undermine non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people, to deny access to healthcare, particularly sexual and reproductive healthcare, disproportionately harming communities of color. This kind of reinterpretation of religious freedom by the Trump administration has actually already led to discrimination against religious minorities and the non-religious as well. In other words, those of us whose religious freedom is most at risk are targeted by regulations supposedly intended to uphold religious freedom. So the Biden administration will need to rescind all of these harmful Trump regulations and immediately establish new guidance that actually protects our religious freedom. And we believe that having staff with expertise on religious freedom policies situated within the Domestic Policy Council will go a long way toward ensuring the White House is able to act swiftly to restore our religious freedom and other non-discrimination protections across all federal agencies. We were especially grateful to hear President-elect Biden commit to repealing the Muslim ban as one of his first priorities. As has already been mentioned, Trump campaigned to become president on a promise to ban all Muslims from traveling to our country. He certainly tried to make good on that promise. It was somewhat successful to the detriment of many families in my own community. And there should be no religious litmus test on our immigration system. And I'm grateful that President-elect Biden understands the need to uphold the First Amendment. I want to also note that for some of our communities, religious freedom extends beyond the traditional First Amendment issues. We're concerned about our basic safety and well-being, our basic ability to even survive attending a religious service. And I was really grateful that Sabrina and Simran have talked about this as well. Trump's encouragement of white supremacist violence has no bounds, as the events of last week have shown. Trump had kind words to say about the white supremacists who chanted "Jews will not replace us" in 2017. The shooter who committed the massacre at the Tree of Life synagogue cited hateful rhetoric that Trump himself had advanced. Hate crimes and hate incidents against Muslims, Sikhs, and others who are frequently targeted by Islamophobia are at an all-time high. We need concerted action to protect religious minorities from the ongoing threat of white supremacist violence. And this will require leadership within the White House and federal agencies with expertise across multiple issue areas. And that includes expertise in the rights and safety of religious minorities. So we think it's important for the White House to have that expertise and that priority among its religious freedom policy understanding. And lastly, I'll just say America must restore its commitment to advancing religious freedom around the world as well. This needs to be a priority both domestically and internationally. We have failed over the past 4 years to prioritize this work, in large part, this work abroad, in large part because we have not done it at home. We're not able to be a leader abroad if we're not being a leader at home. And I'm really heartened that President-elect Biden has already named China's oppression of Uyghur Muslims and other ethnic minorities for what it is, genocide. And we know that this is one of many threats to religious freedom abroad. I am grateful that we are just a few days away now from a Biden administration that we believe will promote religious freedom as part of a comprehensive human rights agenda, both at home and abroad, in recognition of the interdependence of all universal human rights. And given the state of affairs in our nation right now, that day cannot come soon enough. But thanks, I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Maggie. It's very helpful. We'll be talking more in a few moments about our moral leadership abroad. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop them in the Q&A. That'll be easier for us to find rather than the chat as the chat keeps going. If you have questions for our panel, just drop them in the Q&A and we'll look to get to as many of those as possible. Reverend Dr. Carolyn Davis, thanks for being with us and thanks for really co-convening this gathering today, this conversation. I'm wondering in your remarks if you could talk about the interplay of religious liberty, reproductive health and rights, and what's at stake.
Sure, and thank you, Adam and Josh, for the opportunity to be with you, and to my colleagues. I always learn so much when I have an opportunity to be in a virtual or a real space with you, so it's such a pleasure. Just muted myself. Over the course of the last 4 years, sexual and reproductive healthcare access, rights, and justice has been increasingly under attack by the Trump administration and hostile lawmakers in Congress and across the states. As a result, today, STI rates are at the highest levels we've seen in years. Black and Indigenous women are up to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. 20% of Latinx people lack healthcare coverage. Many people have to travel great distances to receive comprehensive healthcare. Abortion access has become even more restricted as federal and state officials attempt to overturn Roe v. Wade. And the COVID-19 pandemic has ripped through communities across the United States and the world, making healthcare access even more challenging for the very people who already face the most barriers. The fact is that politicians have interfered with personal decision-making and bodily autonomy by passing harmful laws and regulations that restrict access to care, both domestically and around the world. And they frequently invoke the concept of religious liberty to justify limiting the rights of others. These policies restricting access to care have fallen hardest on Black people, Indigenous people, and many more people of color. No one should be denied access to comprehensive reproductive health care, including abortion, because of how much money they make, where they live, the source of their insurance or health care, or the religious or personal beliefs of others. As a person of faith myself, I'm an ordained United Methodist minister. I believe that I'm obligated to work with others towards a more just and equitable world where every member of our beloved community has access to affordable health care, including comprehensive reproductive health care, and is free from the threat of discrimination. Millions of Americans share my commitments, and I want to encourage the administration to take seriously the fact that it has a mandate to expand healthcare access and establish true equity in our reproductive healthcare policies. More than 90 organizations, including many faith-based organizations, known as the Blueprint Coalition for Reproductive Health, Rights, and Justice, have come together to propose a series of priorities for the administration in the first 100 days. And I'll throw links to both the shorter first 100 days document as well as the larger blueprint into the chat. Faith-based endorsers include American Jewish World Service, Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, Catholics for Choice, Interfaith Voices for Reproductive Justice, Jewish Women International, and the National Council of Jewish Women. Several of these priorities directly address the way the Trump administration has weaponized our nation's long and profound commitment to religious freedom in order to authorize discrimination and enshrine limitations on essential healthcare coverage in our rules and regulations. Sexual health and rights intersect with and are directly linked to the challenges that a Biden-Harris administration will be expected to confront on day one: the national health crisis, unstable economy, and our reckoning on racial justice. Moreover, the sexual health and rights agenda laid out by the Blueprint Coalition is grounded in the fundamental belief that in order for people to be free and equal, they must be able to exercise complete autonomy over their bodies. This is aligned with the core tenets of reproductive justice: the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and the right to raise that child in a safe and healthy environment. It is also aligned with core teachings of human dignity and the priority of individual conscience celebrated in so many of our religious teachings. I want to take a minute to outline a few of these recommended policies. And again, the rest of them will be included in the document that I'll throw into the chat. First, the Blueprint Coalition is advocating for an executive order on day one from the president that unequivocally states the administration's commitment to protect and expand access to comprehensive reproductive health care, uphold sexual reproductive rights, including abortion care in the US and around the world, and rescind or revoke prior executive actions limiting access to care. And second, I'm going to, there's 5 in total, but second recommendation I'm going to focus on real quick is to recommend that the president, upon assuming office, immediately halt all non-final regulations like the ones that Maggie described in her presentation that limit access to reproductive health care, including abortion. And there's just a few I want to point out that we are urging be pulled back. One, those out there watching may recall the 2017 Executive Order 13798, promoting free speech and religious liberty, which set the stage for expanding the use of religion to discriminate against people seeking reproductive health care, including the rules that allow employers to deny birth control coverage to their employees, and the creation of the HHS Conscience and Religious Freedom Division, which emboldens discrimination and refusals of care. This order must be rescinded and replaced with a commitment to an expansion of care. Second, there's a few rules and regulations that have actually increased the opportunities of healthcare providers to deny care or turn away folks for a variety of conscience reasons, including simply their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so we ask as well that those executive orders be rescinded or rules and regulations be rescinded, as well as one that allows employers to basically non-discriminately, along with universities, deny coverage for contraception, which has affected nearly 61.4 million people who were insured those protections before this rule was put into place. So I'll just finish with saying that the propositions stem from this palpable urgency in light of increasingly hostile attacks on reproductive autonomy and rights for a bold, proactive, and transformative reproductive health rights and justice agenda. This is an incredible opportunity that the administration has and is backed by the endorsement of many, many religious communities to expand sexual health and reproductive rights and do so in a way that truly honors the integrity of our nation's commitment to religious freedom.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. Bishop Joseph Tolton, thanks for joining us, and please give our regards to Bishop Yvette Flender, presiding bishop of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. We're very grateful for her participation in a number of our calls in the last few months. Bishop Tolton, I'm wondering if you could talk about the relationship between the LGBT community and approaches to religious liberty in the new administration, both at home and in relationship to our foreign policy.
Thank you so much, Adam. I certainly will pass on your warm expressions to Bishop Flender. It's good to be with you, and to my most esteemed colleagues. It's always a joy to be in your presence. I think I'm going to probably build a little bit on much of what Dr. Dent has said, so please expect that. I think it's important for us to note that religious freedom, as it was designed and manufactured and packaged by this current administration, has been sold with equal emphasis domestically and globally. The apparatus for the international exports was housed in the United States State Department under the covering of the Commission on Inalienable Rights, which of course was chaired by the outgoing Secretary of State, Secretary Pompeo. I think it's important that as we think about these matters of religious freedom and its impact on the LGBT community, both domestically and abroad, that we certainly understand both the historicity and the utility of religious freedom as it relates to where it is being generated from and where it has come from historically in our country. So let me begin with quoting the outgoing Secretary Pompeo, who said that America is fundamentally good and has much to offer the world because our founders recognized the existence of God-given unalienable rights and designed a durable system to protect them. He went on to say, and the report developed by the Commission on Inalienable Rights, which is the report that really was purposed to have one outcome, which was to enshrine the administration's position on religious liberty and export it globally. That report emphasizes that foremost among our rights, our property rights and religious liberty. No one can enjoy the pursuit of happiness if you can't own the fruits of your labor. And no society can retain its legitimacy or virtuous character without religious freedom. Our founders' new faith was also essential to nurture the private virtue of our citizens. Since abolitionism was born in the Methodist Church in the 1800s, the Black experience in America has been the conscience of progressive people of faith in America. This remains the case and informs the urgent concerns of the religious left as it relates to the current movement of religious freedom in our country and abroad. For progressive faith leaders, first, we must acknowledge and affirm that there is an important and vital conversation about religious freedom that Americans should be having. The ideal called America asks of us some very difficult questions. How do we uphold the integrity of the public square, being a neutral zone, a level playing field, a place that honors our right to have a free and unencumbered consciousness, and therefore behaviors and experiences that honor that consciousness and the need for equity and openness in the public domain. And therefore, the religious freedom conversation should be, how do we negotiate the conflicts that naturally arise between my individual or collective sensibilities and belief systems and what is acceptable and necessary for equal protection under the law? These types of questions are real, they are legitimate, and they are important in particular for a society which defines and prides itself on being pluralistic. The concern for the LGBT community, for progressive faith leaders, for African Americans and other people of color is that this is not the conversation that the American religious right has dragged the country and the world into. From the perspective, again, of queer faith leaders, of the progressive religious left, the religious freedom movement, it must be stated, as we understand it, is a vital variable in a very, very sinister equation which seeks to create minority rule by white conservative fundamental Christians and their allies. Religious freedom, as we currently understand it, is a vital variable in the sinister equation which seeks to create minority rule by white conservative fundamentalist Christians and their allies, who are, of course, fully committed to the reign of corporate interests. This becomes the glue fortifying the American oligarchy. The Commission on Inalienable Rights is arguing that religious freedom and the right to own private property are inextricably linked, and that both are the fundamental and primary rights of not only every American, but every human being, and that these rights must supplant the prioritization of human rights as we have come to understand them globally over the last 25 years. African-American thought leaders understand that in order to create minority rule here in America, the objective is to move America from a democracy to a constitutional republic in which we have an imperial presidency, a shrunken legislative branch, and a highly politicized judiciary. This political scheme is then supported by a radical definition of freedom, which demands a tax policy benefiting the wealthy, labor policies that box in workers, and a narrow understanding of religious freedom. All of this works together to reinforce and to maintain the social and economic status quo. We must not consider these matters of religious freedom in a vacuum, but understand its role within a much more sinister initiative. A strategic approach to religious liberty as it relates to the next 4 years. First, may I speak to the LGBTQ movement. The LGBTQ movement in America must decide if it will reposition itself and stand on the side of intersectional social justice. It is imperative for racial justice advocates, LGBTQ activists, and reproductive justice proponents to be fully aligned in our understanding of the racialization of religious freedom as a tool in the Jim Crow arsenal. We must demand a sharing of resources among communities of color and be fully committed to systemic change, which of course will threaten white supremacy. The LGBTQ movement must find a way to promote the faith voices within its own movement. The Black religious left must become the broker of a new alliance between the LGBT community and the traditional Black church. The Black church must become a witness on the global stage, decrying the exportation of Trumpian religious liberty around the world, and specifically with a focus on Africa. To the incoming administration, its greatest influence is to imagine new political rhetoric defining religious liberty anew. The faith-based offices across the administration must host a government-wide convening that clearly articulates an expansive and inclusive understanding of religious freedom. On the global stage, the US must reorder the prioritization of human rights as our primary and most fundamental right. And to the Biden-Harris incoming administration, convene. The government can create a temperature around these issues. The government can develop policies that speak to a more inclusive understanding of religious liberty. But I do believe that the thing that the incoming administration can do, which will be most important, is to convene the faith voices, the activist voices domestically and globally, who will then speak to the initiatives that are necessary from a grassroots perspective for a new understanding of religious freedom to actually come up from the grassroots to the grass tops. Convene. Elevate our stature, and we will amplify our voices, both here at home and across the global South. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop. Yes, what we have at stake here is an opportunity to change the way that religious liberty has been used as a tool to divide and a tool to terrorize. And make it into a matter of fundamental human rights for all people, and especially for our least served and most marginalized folks and friends around the world. To that end, I'm really grateful that Rori Kramer from American Jewish World Service can join us. And Rori, I'm wondering, as we shift gears to talk more extensively about global leadership and especially global moral leadership regarding human rights and international religious freedom, how are you and your organization thinking through these things in this transition time?
Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm energized to be here with so many accomplished activists and leaders. And to be honest, I really want to build a lot on what Bishop Hilton was referring to, because he really did cover the waterfront of a lot of the issues we're grappling with. But just to take a step back, I'm Rori Kramer, Director of U.S. Advocacy and American Jewish World Service. And AJWS is a faith-based organization that supports human rights activists on the ground around the world in 18 countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And we are working with leaders that are fighting for their civil and political rights, their sexual health and rights, and climate justice in some of the most vulnerable communities in those countries. And we also support their work by mobilizing the American Jewish community and clergy who are committed to advocating for policies that will foster justice and human rights around the world right here at home with the US government. And religious freedom intersects with and motivates so much of the work that we do, as we believe that everyone has the right to receive equal protection under the law, regardless of race, religion, gender, or other identities. And of course, as a Jewish organization, we know from our own history the importance of religious freedom and conscience and having basic rights and dignity. And of course, as you mentioned, Adam, the work to have access to your human rights is more crucial than ever before, as COVID has exacerbated existing inequalities around the world. And authoritarianism and ethno-religious nationalism is on the march in so many places, of course, even at home. And as a lot of people before me have pointed out, corrupt leaders around the world and here are increasingly partnering with these private actors with radical religious motivations and interpretations of religious freedom, which only increases the discrimination and harms people like our partners and their communities face. As Bishop Talton pointed out so aptly, this can clearly be seen almost in a microcosm in Secretary Mike Pompeo's destructive and radical efforts at the department, most notably with the Commission on Inalienable Rights, his very nefarious international religious freedom ministerials, and continued attacks on sexual health and rights around the world, all in the cloak of religious freedom. So of course, over the last 4 years, the Trump administration has also, in addition to that, purposely dismantled our country's leadership on human rights and the rule of law, internationally and at home, with devastating consequences for all of us, but of course with marginalized communities. To combat that, we've consistently worked with congressional allies to mitigate those efforts of Trump and his allies to destroy diplomacy and the human rights system, oftentimes using religion as the main pretext to take those rights away, and oftentimes from the most vulnerable. So just to restate, it bears repeating, even though I know everyone on this call probably knows that freedom of religion is guaranteed by a myriad of international agreements, such as the Article 18 on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and reinforced in other international human rights laws and norms. So simply put, all human rights are interdependent, interrelated, and equal in importance, and it is only by upholding international human rights and ensuring the rights of the most vulnerable that we can create a more just world. And I think it's a great juxtaposition with Secretary Pompeo, a man who purposely confuses the idea of an individual right to religious freedom with a state license to oppress. So while we are looking forward to this new administration in many ways, we have to keep in mind the damage that was done by Trump and Pompeo and their allies on these issues if we are to make it better. They have dangerously misrepresented religious freedom, as people have spoken before me on this. And this is highly offensive to many within the faith community. And most importantly, I really hope that we can all keep in mind moving forward into this new administration that we do not have to fall into the trap of accepting their definition, their nefarious distortion of what religious freedom means. Instead, we can all come together, the idea that people are all created in the divine or in any equal vision, and that idea demands that all people are deserving of equal dignity. So to do this, we are very eager to work with the Biden-Harris administration to begin centering human rights and international cooperation into US foreign policy, and knowing that the faith community has their backs to do this. So there are 4 areas that I want to touch on today that need immediate attention from the new administration. The first is to reaffirm and recommit the United States to international human rights system and diplomacy by doing a few things: rejoining and refunding multilateral organizations and agreements, for example, the UN Human Rights Council, the Paris Climate Accord, and the UN Population Fund; to reject the Trump administration's efforts to undermine the international human rights systems within our own agencies, such as we mentioned, the Commission completely disavowing the Commission on Unalienable Rights and its report, also disavowing the Geneva Consensus, and denouncing all narrow definitions of religious freedom that have acted as a cudgel on the rights of marginalized people; to rebuild and reinvigorate the State Department, USAID, National Security Council by appointing qualified and diverse individuals. We're off to a good start there already, and supporting career servants, experts, and bolstering the tools available to them to support their human rights work across all of our foreign policy. And I think this also includes restarting the important work of diplomats on the ground that has been frozen by Pompeo's decrees, wrapped in brazen religiosity, and as some other folks have mentioned, also freezing these really nefarious regulations they're trying to put in place. The second area is to promote comprehensive sexual and reproductive health and rights for all people, has also been mentioned. This includes immediately rescinding the global gag rule and committing to work with Congress to ensure its permanent legislative repeal. encouraging the repeal of the Helms Amendment, which prevents U.S. foreign assistance from supporting women, girls, and LGBTQI+ folks in accessing safe abortion services, and protecting and promoting the rights of LGBTQI people across the globe, including enforcing non-discrimination in service delivery, increasing global funding and budgets, and protection of rights in legislation. The third area we'd like to see movement on is to restore U.S. leadership in promoting democracy and justice around the world, and obviously focusing a little bit at home as well. But the first area would be around using all available diplomatic and economic levers to ensure the rights of minority communities, journalists, human rights activists, human rights defenders, that they are respected and upheld, and supporting the civil and political rights of all people around the world to protest abusive governments, supporting credible domestic and international justice efforts for victims of human rights abuses in the wake of conflict or mass atrocities, including often overlooked communities in places like Burma, Nicaragua, Sri Lanka, and to continue the use of the global Magnitsky sanctions regime against those who commit massive human rights abuses, while also working with Congress to reauthorize the robust use of that authority. And the fourth area is to ensure a just and robust U.S. response to COVID efforts. And this would include a passage of a robust COVID relief package with at least $20 billion in international funding that will combat both the health, but also the human rights aspects of the ongoing pandemic, especially to the most marginalized communities and those that have been scapegoated by their own governments because of the pandemic. And of course, rejoining the World Health Organization and participating in all global efforts to secure and distribute an accessible vaccine for all. So in conclusion, every day in our work, we're really gratified to work with our partners, but we see firsthand how U.S. policies and leadership affects the lives of our partners, the people they serve, and the ability for them to do their critical work. So to achieve success for them, the U.S. must uphold, protect, and promote human rights norms for all people, especially the most vulnerable. And this includes women and girls and LGBTQI+ folks and marginalized identities who bear the brunt of discrimination and inequality within their societies, often under the guise of religious freedom. Ensuring we are protecting all people's religious freedom and belief is directly related to and on equal footing with ensuring that we are also promoting their human rights to political participation, free expression, assembly, access to information, combating inequality, and all accesses to rights. So as we all work for a more just world at home and abroad, this must be at the core of what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Rori. I'm bringing in Jen Smyers from Church World Service next, and really grateful for their work on immigration and refugee services. And at the core of at the foundation of the Trump administration, we saw how they were running roughshod over norms, including embrace and welcoming of our refugee and immigrant neighbors. It's one of the reasons why I joined a multi-faith prayer gathering at the Portland field office for ICE, and we were arrested just for simply asking for our friends that were locked inside to be released. Thankfully, 123 Oregon detainees were released and their charges dropped, but it's still a matter of deep concern for those of us in the faith community. So Jen, I'm wondering if you could help us think through this, that the Trump administration's policies on immigration and refugees have had grave implications for religious freedom. What recommendations do you have for change?
Great. Thank you so much for having me on this important panel. And absolutely, we've all seen under the Trump administration egregious policies that have violated the rights, the very lives of immigrants and refugees. They have also violated the concept of religious liberty and the concept of human rights at a very basic level. And that's why, I maybe a few years ago would have been maybe the only panelist talking about the importance of refugee and immigration policy. And today I'm at least heartened to see every single one of the panelists mentioned the importance of U.S. immigration policy and the U.S. refugee resettlement program, access to asylum. These are really foundational to many of us living out our faiths, but also to people's very ability to live, to exist, and to practice their own faiths. Under the Trump administration, we saw a historic cut to refugee resettlement to an all-time low of only 15,000 refugees, even being the ceiling of how many refugees could come in and not even close to being met. That was a historically low number. That includes a historically low number and a cut to religious minorities from around the world. And this was at the same time that the Trump administration, especially Secretary Pompeo, were claiming that they were prioritizing religious minorities, was the same time that they were actually reducing religious minorities who were able to access protection in the United States. As has been said, the many Muslim bans and other immigration policies that disproportionately impacted individuals who were Muslim and individuals from Muslim majority countries really made a massive impact on people's lives who were seeking protection. And also welcoming the stranger, the entire US refugee resettlement program, the sanctuary movement are all things that have been built over decades by people of faith. Those are really trampled on by the Trump administration. And those policies kept people in harm's way, separated families, and reduced the capacity of our country to respond to displacement crises and to welcome people at our doors. So I'm going to talk about 3 specific priorities related to immigration for the incoming Biden administration. And that includes making sure that we're rebuilding the refugee resettlement program, we're restoring and improving access to asylum and protection, and we're making sure that we are reforming our immigration policies, including how current immigration policies are enforced. So first, in terms of refugee resettlement, we really applaud the Biden and Harris transition team and campaign and incoming administration for the commitment to increase refugee resettlement to 125,000 refugees. That certainly is commensurate with the largest displacement crisis the world has ever seen, which is what we're witnessing right now. We want to make sure, however, that can be met. And there's a lot of damage that was done by the Trump administration that will not only have to be undone, but improvements that have to be made to processing, to overseas work, and to domestic integration programming to make sure that 125,000 can actually be met. We would like to see on day 1 an executive order signed that rescinds the many Muslim bans. We want to make sure that an executive order is signed that provides an indication to Congress that the presidential determination on the number of refugees will be changed, and then setting that presidential determination. We need to make sure that we're seeing executive orders and directives to the various agencies, making sure that those changes can be met and in a timely way. We also strongly recommend that in order to make that happen, there is a White House coordinator, someone who can ensure that that's happening, and that the interagency cooperation, including an interagency audit of the security check process, which has continued to take far too long for people who are seeking protection, can be done. So this needs to touch on Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Health and Human Services, and the many agencies that are involved in the robust security checks that refugees undergo. We also need to make sure that that commitment is met not only in policy and in words, but also in dollars. We are going to need an investment to rebuild the refugee resettlement program and to make sure that it can continue to be a strength. That includes specifically integration programming at the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which has been historically underfunded, and making sure that as we rebuild, we do that in a way that is client-centered and outcomes-focused will be really critical. The second priority is making sure that we are safeguarding, but also improving our access to asylum and protection. So we're encouraged by the commitment of the incoming administration to end the Remain in Mexico, or the MPP policy, but we need to make sure that we're ending all anti-protection policies that we saw under the Trump administration and even prior, including so-called safe third country agreements that really just allow our country to deport people back into harm's way. We need to make sure that we're increasing due process and protections and protecting the rights of asylum seekers. We can do that by increasing capacity to process and to make sure that all asylum seekers' cases are heard in a timely manner, but we also have to invest in partnerships with faith and community-based shelters, alternatives to detention, and post-release services to make sure that we are ending migrant detention all together and making sure that we're scaling up ways for individuals' needs to be met while they're awaiting their asylum claims to be heard. And those partners are ready and willing to scale up their capacity, including with COVID precautions. So one of the other pieces of this is ensuring access to legal orientation programs, know your rights programs, and representation to make sure that people can know that their case will be fairly heard. And that also increases the likelihood that they will actually show up for their hearings. And then the third priority is, again, we really applaud the incoming administration's commitment to a 100-day moratorium on deportations, but we are going to need to go further. We urge the incoming administration to do everything in their power to utilize prosecutorial discretion in order to provide various forms of relief to our undocumented community members, including those who have deportation orders and who are still in sanctuary, trying to make sure that they can remain with their families and their communities. We also need to make sure that those who were deported under the Trump administration can return to their families and their communities here in the United States. We want to see the administration not only protecting, but expanding access to the DACA and TPS programs that we know are crucial to so many people's lives. And we're also very supportive of really re-engaging an Office of New Americans to make sure that we're supporting the interagency coordination and integration programming and policies. We're very excited, especially about the incoming administration's commitment to work with Congress in particular on an immigration reform bill. And that bill has to ensure that there's a pathway to full citizenship for people who are undocumented. It also needs to reduce backlogs and barriers to people reuniting with their family members. And we're very much looking forward to working with the incoming administration and the new Congress to that end.
Thank you, Jen. We have some time for dialogue and conversation. We will be taking questions in the Q&A. The chat has been disabled. It's just easier for us to get the conversation going in the Q&A. So if you have a question, feel free to drop it in there and we'll try to get to as many as we possibly can. The first question I have for the panel, and this is a very general but very important question, is how can everyday people get involved in urging their leaders to adopt these recommendations? Maggie, do you have a thought on this? Let's put you on the spot.
Well, with regard to the recommendations that I put forward, I mean, I think lending your voice in support of religious freedom and in support of the priorities that we know the Biden administration is going to need to accomplish will be super valuable. I think for those of you who are from communities of faith, making clear what a religious freedom agenda looks like for you is incredibly important. I think for too long, the religious right has essentially hijacked the notion of religious freedom and has tried to redefine it as being about Christian nationalism. And if you want to understand what Christian nationalism is, just look at the crosses and the Jesus Saves signs last week in the riots that took place outside the Capitol. That has nothing to do with Christianity, nothing to do with religion, and nothing to do with religious freedom. But unfortunately, those are the kinds of folks that have dictated for far too long what religious freedoms look like, or rather, what advocacy around religious freedom has looked like. And now is the moment to reclaim the kind of agenda that we want to see, one that actually values our right to worship safely and without fear, that honors the rights of people of all religions and the non-religious, and everything that everybody's already outlined today. And so I think lending your voice in advocating for these regulations from the administration, supporting legislation that will help strengthen our religious freedom in a true form, like that is the best possible thing you can do. And I'm sure anyone on this panel can immediately refer you to like 5 different action items that you can do to get specific policies passed.
Thank you. Yeah, Dr. Dent, I'm wondering if you have some further thoughts on this.
Yes. I mean, from the beginning, one of the things I said is that people should not divorce themselves from the issues. Like they have to see themselves in the issues, and they have to know what is, as Maggie stated, what's important to you and to your community. And so raise visibility on it. Last year, so at Americans United last year, we hosted a national advocacy summit, and we had people to talk to their representatives. People have to remember that, you know, the representatives are just that, they are representing the people. And so you have to raise the concerns and the needs that you have as a community and speak to those. At the same time, I mean, there are many ways in which we have people to engage in our work at Americans United. So, for example, in my role as the senior faith advisor, we have the Faith Leaders United list, and sometimes we send out ask and requests to those communities. To take action on church-state issues or religious freedom issues. And so at Americans United, there has, we also put forth recommendations for the Biden-Harris administration for them to adhere to. And again, one of the things I want to go back to is when one of those things was the Do No Harm Act, right? For me, it's about thinking about the moral injuries that come up with some of the policies that have come forth over the last 4 years. What is the moral injury to you? What is the moral injury to your community? So when I say like see yourself in it, like think about the people that you love and think about how you would want action to take place. And I want to say this, that's if you love your family. That's if you love people that are a part of your community, because there are some people that may not feel that way. But I think those are ways in which you could do that. And I'll share the link to AU's recommendations in the chat for those that are interested.
And Bishop.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As you know, through the comments that I gave, I deeply believe in intersectionalism. And I think that a way to confuse and to disorganize the opposition is to really have unlikely alliances. So how can you, just the average person, do it? I think it's about developing unlikely alliances. Imagine an alliance and a campaign developed and produced by a chapter of Black Lives Matter in conjunction with a young progressive youth Jewish group, in conjunction with younger reformed evangelicals and Muslims for progressive change or progressive values. These unlikely intersectional alliances, I think, will be incredibly important to advancing this issue over the next 2 to 4 years.
Thank you, Bishop. I want to move on to a question from Kyle Christofalo. The organization, this is his question. The organization I work for has been highly critical of many actions of this administration, but we have had constructive engagement with Ambassador Sam Brownback in his office at IRF. They were highly accessible even to groups that are, again, opposed to many of the actions of the current administration. I'm curious if any panelists or folks from the transition team can discuss what they see as the role of the IRF office and how Biden can effectively utilize it in a way that brings in civil society. International Religious Freedom is IRF, for those watching.
I'm sorry. No, Rori, please.
No, you go ahead.
No, I defer to you, Rori, please.
Maybe I'll just speak quickly.
First Rori, and then Bishop. Yeah.
You know, I agree with those comments. You know, AGWS actually publicly came out against Ambassador Brownback's nomination. We whipped against his vote, and he met with us several times on many issues. So I would agree that he was certainly, in his office, were more accessible than others in the department and more productive. You know, that being said, this position existed before the Trump administration. It was held by very accomplished people during the Obama administration, so there's no reason that it can't again. One of the things that we're hoping for and advocating for is that it's right-sized, right? Like it used to be in a line of hierarchy at the State Department that really made sense for broader human rights, of which, of course, international religious freedom is part of. We also took umbrage of many things that the Trump administration, the Pompeo State Department did, was how they put it above, really sort of visualizing that they put religious freedom above all the rights. And so we'd really like to see this administration change that and make it part and parcel and interrelated with all of the other human rights work the department is doing.
Thank you, Rori. I just wanted to echo of what Rori said, essentially, which is that it really is about right sizing. I, along with colleagues from Rori's office at American Jewish World Service, did have the opportunity to meet with Ambassador Brownback. And yes, I think that he did receive us in ways that would have been unexpected. But the right sizing is so important in that there was, of course, the International Office for Religious Freedom, as well as an Office of Religious Engagement at the State Department. And one balanced the other. One was purely focused on how the US could intervene where there were really conflicts around religious freedom. The other office was a space for advocacy around the role of religion and faith as it relates to informing our foreign policy. That office, I think, has to be resurrected and reconstructed and reimagined. And that right sizing is really important.
For our panelists, if you have position papers or even a copy of your remarks today, we have a number of folks that would love to share those with others in written form. So drop that in the chat if you can. As well, for those watching live right now, we are recording this and we will send this out to everyone that's RSVP'd for the event. If you'd like to join the Faith 2020 mailing list, you can do so through faith2020.org. We have another question here, and it is picking up on Simran's points earlier. This is from Jennifer Gilliard. As a minister and social worker, I wonder, will the interfaith community and social workers be included in the immigration talks and bill drafting? Moreover, will these groups be included in the talks about racial justice and profiling? Any thoughts from the panel on the importance of why this truly matters when it comes to crafting public policy?
I can just jump in and sort of
Thank you.
Restate something that I think every single person has said so far today, which is, and I see some other questions along these lines as well, and I think it's critical for us to sort of wrap our heads around this, to think of religious freedom as exclusively an issue about particular religious communities, and to think about the work of religious communities as exclusive to religious freedom is really limiting. It's not how we live our lives, and it's not how we want to be constructing these policies. And so over and over again, the phrase I've heard from this group, and I've heard it also from the administration, the incoming administration, is this idea of intersectionality. And that to me is something that I haven't heard before from a policy perspective that takes religious actors seriously, that says to think about religion is to think about anti-racism. I mean, over and over again from this administration, we've heard that their top priority when it comes to religious communities is anti-racism. I mean, we wouldn't have heard that 10 years ago. We wouldn't have heard that 20 years ago. And so now to take this new lens, I mean, it's not a new lens, but to take this now popularized lens and this popularly accepted lens of intersectionality and to say, well, what do you have to contribute when it comes to issues around immigration, LGBTQ issues, human rights? Like, these are issues that we care about and are concerned about and have been working on and are affected by seriously in different ways. These are complex issues. They require complex solutions, and it's time for us to bring our perspectives to the table. And so for me, I found it incredibly heartening and reassuring to know that at least this incoming administration has expressed a receptivity to our perspectives, to see that there is a different way of looking at these issues, that we've been missing something in the past. I think to me, that's where we're coming from, and I'm really hopeful that there's movement in this regard now.
I'll just jump in there if I may. I think Simran just hit the nail on the head, that my hope is that the religious community outreach that this administration undertakes will look similar to what we saw, honestly, on the campaign trail to some extent. I thought the Biden campaign did a phenomenal job of recognizing that our identities cannot be simply, kind of put in different boxes in different places. And they would engage a group of Jews of color. It would engage a group of LGBTQ Christians, right? And recognize those overlapping identities and what that expression feels like. And so my hope is that similarly, the Office of Public Engagement, both within the White House and other agencies, will recognize the religious diversity, the racial diversity, and then the other aspects of the diversity within our religious communities as they engage with us, and recognize that our issue areas that we are concerned about cannot simply be boxed into even religious freedom on its own, or any of these other kind of hot button issues, but rather that we are concerned about racial justice, we are concerned about immigration, we are concerned about climate change, we're concerned about a different host of areas, and engaging with religious communities needs to look like, needs to be integrated with the ways that we engage with all different communities on these issues.
Thank you, Maggie. We've got a great question from Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, who says it's a refreshing conversation. Thank you, Guthrie. His question is this: how do we make sure this religious freedom conversation is part of the national discussion about religious freedom that feels dominated by anti-LGBTQ and anti-reproductive rights activists? Carolyn, maybe you could talk about the reproductive rights piece.
Sure, yeah. And I'm going to focus mainly my answer on domestic policy because that's my area of expertise, but I'd invite anyone to kind of help piggyback. I think one of the things that we have to do is really continue down this line of thinking intersectionally about identities and not cede ground on how we frame this conversation. So often the way we frame it is LGBT protections versus religious rights. We put these things at odds with one another and allow for this kind of zero-sum conversation that, one, ignores the fact that there are a vast number of LGBT people, for instance, of faith. There are a vast number of people of faith who have abortions. There is an overwhelming number of people of faith, a huge majority of folks who do not want to see Roe v. Wade overturned. So when we talk about these issues, we need to remember that the identities, the life experiences, the mindsets that come along with how folks think about these issues are not in these same oppositional categories. But when we yield to that way of thinking, we end up allowing for this idea, one, that religion is somehow so sacred a right that it must trump all other rights at all times, and that religion is in opposition to public accommodation, is in opposition to the right to move freely through our communities. When in fact, an understanding of religious liberty that allows for a maximization of freedom, a maximization of our ability to be in relationship with one another in this country, makes it easier for all of us to practice our faith in ways that strengthen our communities. So rhetorically, we really need to regroup on how we have this conversation, and refuse to play the language game that the opposition is setting up for us. And then I think in addition, one of the things that we need to do is exactly what Maggie said, which is open up this larger conversation around the way that these issues affect other kinds of policy issues that we engage with. And so if we can get ourselves out of the idea that the only way to think about religious liberty is in restricting what people do with their reproductive parts, and to this larger question about how religious communities are able to engage on a whole host of issues, and folks of non-belief or secular belief are able to engage their communities, engage with government, engage with members of a variety of their community of a variety of beliefs, then we open up new and creative ways to have this conversation.
Thanks, Carolyn. Bishop, do you have a thought on that, a brief thought?
I mean, my thought there is that I think it's really important that as we reimagine what religious liberty really can be, that we continue to lift up the fact that it can never be seen in a vacuum, and that this idea of exalting religious liberty and supplanting human rights as we've come to understand them over the last 25 years is an incredibly important part of this more sinister plot, which is really about white minority rule. And we saw how awful that can manifest itself last week. It is important that we brand their version of religious liberty for what it is. I think that would be motivating and compelling.
Amen. Amen. Sabrina, Dr. Sabrina.
Yes, I just want to add to that conversation, to what has already been stated, that in including the identities of everyone, that we have to remember that there are many layers to our identities, right? And that no one group is a monolith. So when we're talking about, as Christian nationalism has been raised in this conversation, we have to remember there are Christianities. We have to remember that there are many identities, as far as Jewish groups, as far as Muslims, as well as Baha'is, and even when we're talking about non-believers. So in this conversation, I even thinking about my friends with Black non-believers who are a spectrum of individuals and their identities. And so we have to take that into consideration when we're also thinking about policies, and when we think about how policies impact people and our understanding of the different communities. In this work, I would even suggest that when we're even talking about do no harm, that we think about religious identity, and the many different identities that come with the person, especially when you're talking about people of color, when you think about the ethnicities and the many different cultural positions and understandings that people have. So it's a layered conversation. So I appreciate that that the Biden-Harris team has been intentional about having these conversations, and they do need to be translated in terms of policies in ways that, again, are non-discriminatory and that are not coercive, that do not cause moral injury or harm to anyone.
Absolutely. As a recovering evangelical myself, I often think that we need to open up interfaith dialogue with some of our neighbors, family, and friends. And I'm eager to be part of that in terms of seeking healing and the common good. Really grateful for this panel. Want to bring on Josh Dixon for any kind of final words, who's been leading faith efforts for the transition. I know it's a very busy time, Josh, but Josh?
Thanks so much, Adam, and thank you to everyone who helped set today up, who attended today, and who spoke today. It's been deeply informative. I've been taking copious notes on my end, and I also want to reinforce that conversations like this are just the first step. To your point, Dr. Dent, it's going to be important to translate these. And right now we're in this listening phase. And then it's going to be important for the administration to take this and move with it. So deeply, deeply grateful for y'all's partnership in phase one here. And I think that, we all agree that our Constitution makes it really, really clear that there are core commitments that make us who we are as a country, and the way we go about and approach those it's important, and the way that we're intentional about that and upholding those principles really matters for people in so many different ways. And it was great to hear more about what that looks like and get some very practical recommendations from folks on the programming and policy side during this conversation. I also really appreciate the focus on intersectionality and the focus on just the ways in which so many issues interact, and that policymaking needs to acknowledge that, be cognizant of that, and take that very, very seriously. So really, really appreciate that. And before I run, I just want to remind folks again about the conversation we're hosting tomorrow on COVID and communities of color. Would love for folks to attend. I put the link to that in the chat, and we'll make sure to get that out to folks after this. And then I know that a lot of folks have questions about the inauguration and things like that. And I just want to point everyone to the inaugural website, bideninaugural.org. That's where you can find all up-to-date information. Again, thank you so much for having me. Really, really appreciate this conversation, and looking forward to continuing it in the days and weeks ahead.
Thank you, Josh. As we face the transition in 7.5 days, this inauguration on noon next Wednesday, I invite us all to root down, to find our breath, to catch moments of hope where we can, whether that's in prayer, meditation, or just mindfulness. We were joined last Wednesday by Valley Kwar, who gave a very, very powerful introduction to a spiritual practice. If you want to check that out, it's on our YouTube and Facebook page. I'm so grateful for this panel. We will share the recording tonight or tomorrow morning. And very grateful for my friend and colleague, Reverend Dr. Carolyn Davis, to help co-convene this. We ask that you all remain safe and be hopeful. Change is coming. Peace.